Every masterpiece carries the soul of its maker, but some carry secrets as well. You have seen her smile countless times. In books, on walls, in fleeting glances at reproductions, the woman they call Mona Lisa. You believe you know that face, that expression, that mysterious quality that has captivated minds for centuries, but you see only what I allowed you to see. What you do not know is what lies beneath. The hours I spent in cold chambers studying the dead, the dissections that taught me how muscles move beneath skin, how light catches the curve of an eyelid, how the smallest asymmetry can suggest life itself. You see a portrait. I painted an anatomical study disguised as beauty. The smile you find so enigmatic, it exists because I understood what others did not. The human face is never truly symmetrical, and in that imperfection lies the illusion of breath. Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from, and if this story stays with you, you're welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next. My curiosity about the human form began not with beauty, but with necessity. As a young apprentice in Andrea del Verrocchio's workshop, I watched master painters struggle with the same fundamental problem. They painted what they thought bodies looked like, not what they truly were. Arms hung at impossible angles. Faces lacked the subtle asymmetries that give life to flesh. Eyes stared without the micro movements that suggest thought behind them. The church taught that the human body was sacred, created in God's image, and therefore not to be violated by the blade. To cut into human flesh was to defile the divine. This prohibition extended even to the dead, whose bodies awaited resurrection. Artists learned anatomy from ancient texts, from Roman statues worn smooth by time, from the careful observation of living models who could never reveal what lay beneath their skin. But I could not paint what I did not understand. How could I render the curve of a shoulder without knowing the deltoid muscle that shaped it? How could I capture the subtle depression at the base of a throat without understanding the relationship between the clavicle and the surrounding tendons? The masters before me had developed conventions, shortcuts that approximated human form. These satisfied patrons and pleased the eye, but they were lies dressed as truth. My first anatomical notebook began as sketches of horses. Animals were different. Their dissection raised no theological concerns. In the stables of the Duke of Milan, I spent hours studying the musculature of dead horses, understanding how their powerful frames supported movement and weight. I learned that beneath every surface lay a complex architecture of muscle, bone, and sinew, each component serving multiple purposes, each connected to others in ways that determined not just function, but form. The transition from horses to humans came gradually, born of opportunity rather than bold decision. Brother Giovanni, at the monastery of Santa Maria Nuova, approached me quietly one winter evening. The old monk had noticed my sketches, my questions about the workings of the body. He had also noticed my discretion. In the monastery's infirmary, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, especially during the harsh months when the ground froze solid. The church forbids what you seek, he told me in his careful way. But God gave us minds to understand His creation. Perhaps understanding and defiling are not the same thing. His offer was simple. In exchange for my silence and a small donation to the monastery's works, I could pursue my studies in the cold stone chambers beneath the infirmary, working only at night, removing no organs, leaving no obvious signs of my investigation. My hands trembled the first time I made an incision into human flesh. The body was that of an old man, a pilgrim who had died peacefully in his sleep. Even in death, his face held a serenity that made my work feel like violation. But as the blade parted the skin of his cheek, revealing the layered structure beneath, my reverence shifted from the spiritual to the mechanical. Here was the zygomaticus major, the muscle that lifts the corner of the mouth in a smile. Here was the levator labis superioris, which raises the upper lip. Here were the delicate fibers that, in life, had created every expression this man had ever worn. I worked by candlelight, my anatomical notebook growing thick with observations. The dead taught me what the living could not. I discovered that facial muscles are unlike those in the rest of the body. While arm and leg muscles are designed for gross movement, facial muscles are instruments of precision, capable of movements so subtle they can convey thoughts that words cannot express. The muscles around the eyes alone consisted of multiple distinct groups, each responsible for different types of expression, each connected to others in ways that created the complex interplay we recognize as emotion. But my most significant discovery came from studying asymmetry. The church's artistic traditions demanded perfect symmetry, believing it reflected divine perfection. Yet every face I studied in those underground chambers told a different story. The left and right sides of human faces are never identical. Muscles develop differently based on habitual expressions, on which side of the mouth a person favors when speaking, on countless small variations in how an individual moves through the world. This asymmetry, I realized, was not a flaw to be corrected, but the very source of what we perceive as life in a face. During those long nights in the monastery's depths, I began to understand why traditional portraits looked dead despite their technical skill. Artists painted symmetrical faces because they believed symmetry was beautiful, but symmetry in human features creates the uncanny stillness we associate with death. Life exists in the small imperfections, the barely perceptible differences between left and right, the micro-expressions that suggest movement even in stillness. My anatomical notebook became my most treasured possession, more valuable to me than any commission or payment. Its pages contained knowledge that could revolutionize not just painting but human understanding itself. I discovered that expressions are not emotional states but mechanical functions. A smile is not happiness made visible, but the specific contraction of particular muscle groups. Sadness is not a feeling that somehow appears on the face, but the relaxation of certain muscles combined with the tension of others. This knowledge carried both promise and danger. If the church discovered my work, I would face more than professional ruin. Dissection of human bodies could be considered heresy, punishable by excommunication or worse. Yet I could not unknow what I had learned. Every portrait I was commissioned to paint became an opportunity to apply this forbidden knowledge, to create faces that possessed the subtle asymmetries and muscle tensions that suggest life rather than merely depicting it. The irony was not lost on me. The church that forbade my study of human anatomy was the same institution that commissioned religious paintings requiring the most lifelike human figures. They wanted angels that looked alive, saints whose faces could inspire genuine devotion, biblical scenes populated by figures that viewers would accept as real, yet they prohibited the very studies that would make such realism possible. As my understanding deepened, I began to see traditional paintings differently. The stiff formality that I had once attributed to artistic convention now revealed itself as ignorance. Artists painted what they thought muscles should look like, not what they actually were. They rendered symmetrical faces because they had never seen how real faces were constructed. They created expressions based on emotional assumptions rather than mechanical understanding. My notebooks multiplied, filled with detailed drawings of every facial muscle, studies of how different combinations of muscle contractions created different expressions, observations about how light and shadow could be used to enhance or diminish the appearance of particular muscle groups. I was accumulating knowledge that would allow me to paint the human face with unprecedented accuracy, but I needed the right opportunity to apply it fully. That opportunity would come in the form of a commission that seemed routine, but would become my greatest achievement. A wealthy silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo wanted a portrait of his young wife Lisa. He had no idea that he was about to provide me with the perfect canvas for revolutionizing portraiture itself. The cold penetrated everything in those underground chambers. Stone walls wept moisture that never dried, and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of centuries. I learned to bring extra candles, knowing that the drafts would claim half of them before dawn. My fingers grew accustomed to working in near-freezing conditions, developing a steadiness that served me well both in dissection and in painting. Brother Giovanni's arrangement proved more valuable than either of us had anticipated. The monastery's location made it a natural stopping point for pilgrims, merchants, and travelers, and winter claimed a steady number of them. Each body that arrived in the infirmary represented a new opportunity to understand the mechanics of human expression. I began to recognize the subtle differences between faces shaped by different lives, different habitual expressions, different ways of moving through the world. The preserved human heart that I kept in a jar of wine became my most instructive specimen, not for its own anatomy, which I had studied thoroughly, but for what it taught me about the connections between emotional and physical expression. Medieval physicians believed the heart controlled all feeling, sending invisible humors through the body to create expression on the face. But my dissections revealed a different truth. The heart was simply a muscle, no different from those in the arm or leg, pumping blood through an elaborate network of vessels. What truly controlled facial expression lay much closer to the surface. The network of muscles beneath the skin operated with mechanical precision, each fiber responding to signals from the brain through thread-like nerves I could trace with my fingertip. The heart contributed only by supplying blood to these muscles, giving them the fuel to contract and relax. Expression was not mysterious communication from the seat of emotion, but simple mechanical cause and effect. My most significant breakthrough came while studying the face of a young woman who had died in childbirth. Her features, relaxed in death, showed none of the animation that had surely characterized her in life. But as I carefully dissected the muscles around her mouth, I discovered something that would change everything I understood about painting portraits. The zygomaticus major, the primary muscle responsible for lifting the corner of the mouth in a smile, was not symmetrical. On the left side of her face, this muscle was slightly more developed, suggesting she had favored that side when smiling. More importantly, the muscle fibers themselves were arranged in a way that would have created a subtle upward curve even when relaxed. This woman's resting expression would have appeared to carry the ghost of a smile, not because she was particularly happy, but because years of smiling had shaped the very architecture of her face. I began to understand that faces are not fixed structures, but dynamic landscapes shaped by a lifetime of expressions. Every habitual gesture leaves its mark in the development of particular muscle groups. A person who frowns often develops stronger corrugator muscles above the eyebrows. Someone who laughs frequently shows enhanced development in the muscles around the eyes. These changes are subtle, invisible to casual observation, but they create the fundamental asymmetries that make each face unique. Working with another body, that of an elderly scholar who had died while copying manuscripts, I discovered the intimate connection between the muscles around the eyes and those controlling the mouth. When I stimulated the orbicularis oculi, the muscle that circles each eye, I observed corresponding movements in the levator labii superioris, which raises the upper lip. Even in death, these muscles retain their connections, their learned patterns of coordinated movement. This discovery revealed why traditional portraits looked so lifeless despite their technical competence. Artists painted smiles as isolated phenomena, lifting the corners of the mouth without considering the corresponding changes around the eyes. The subtle tightening of muscles in the cheeks, the barely perceptible shift in the position of the lower eyelids. A true smile, I realized, involves the entire lower half of the face working in harmony, each muscle group supporting and enhancing the others. But my most profound insight came from studying the mechanics of transition between expressions. Using a series of careful incisions, I could trace how a face moved from neutral to smiling, identifying each stage of muscle contraction and the sequence in which different groups activated. What I discovered was that the most captivating faces were not those caught in full expression, but those captured in the moment of transition, when some muscle groups had begun to contract while others remained relaxed. This transitional state created an ambiguity that the human eye found compelling. The viewer's mind, accustomed to reading complete expressions, would attempt to interpret the partial signals, often seeing movement where none existed. A face painted in this transitional state would appear to be on the verge of completing its expression, creating the illusion that the subject was about to speak, laugh, or reveal some hidden thought. The technical challenge was immense. How could I paint these subtle muscle tensions with sufficient accuracy to create the desired effect? Traditional painting techniques, with their emphasis on clear outlines and defined forms, were inadequate for capturing the soft gradations of muscle beneath skin. I would need to develop new methods. new ways of layering paint to suggest the barely perceptible swells and depressions that indicated particular states of muscular tension. My experiments with light revealed another crucial element. The way candlelight fell across the faces I studied in those underground chambers created shadows that enhanced the visibility of subtle muscle contractions. Certain angles of illumination made barely perceptible tensions obvious, while others obscured them entirely. I began to understand that the direction and quality of light in a portrait was not merely a matter of artistic preference, but a tool for controlling which anatomical details the viewer would perceive. During one particularly productive session, working with the body of a merchant who had died with a slight smile on his lips, I discovered that the famous enigmatic quality I had observed in certain living faces was actually the result of specific muscle configurations. When the zygomaticus major contracted slightly on one side while remaining relaxed on the other, when the levator labii superioris showed tension while the depressor anguli oris remained neutral, the resulting expression defied easy interpretation. The viewer's mind, encountering this combination of signals, would fluctuate between reading the expression as happiness, sadness, contemplation, or amusement. The face would seem to change depending on the angle from which it was viewed, the quality of light falling upon it, even the emotional state of the observer. This was not mystery but mechanics, not spiritual communication, but the precise manipulation of muscle groups to create controlled ambiguity. As winter gave way to spring and my nocturnal studies continued, I accumulated a detailed understanding of facial anatomy that far exceeded anything documented by previous artists or physicians. My notebooks contained precise drawings of every muscle involved in expression, detailed notes on how different combinations created different effects, and most importantly, a systematic understanding of how to paint these effects convincingly. I was ready to apply this knowledge, but I needed the right subject and the right opportunity. The commission would need to be prestigious enough to justify the time and effort such a revolutionary approach would require, yet not so visible that questions would be raised about my unconventional methods. When Francesco del Giocondo's letter arrived, requesting a portrait of his wife Lisa, I recognized it immediately as the perfect opportunity to transform everything I had learned in those cold chambers into a single extraordinary work of art. Francesco del Giocondo's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a young apprentice who waited while I read its contents. The request seemed routine enough. A successful silk merchant wanted a portrait of his third wife, Lisa Gherardini, to commemorate their marriage and demonstrate his prosperity to business associates. He had heard of my work from mutual acquaintances and was prepared to pay well for a painting that would reflect both his wife's beauty and his own refined taste. What Francesco could not have known was that his timing was perfect. My anatomical studies had reached a point where I understood the mechanics of facial expression better than any artist before me, yet I had never had the opportunity to apply this knowledge to a major portrait commission. Most of my previous work had been religious subjects or court paintings with predetermined compositions and expressions. This commission offered something different, the freedom to paint a living subject whose natural expressions I could observe and analyze. I agreed to meet with Lisa Gherardini the following week, but was already planning something far more ambitious than Francesco had requested. This portrait would become my laboratory, the canvas on which I would test everything I had learned in those cold underground chambers. If successful, it would demonstrate that painting could be more than decoration or documentation. It could be scientific inquiry disguised as art. Lisa arrived at my studio on a spring morning when the light fell perfectly through the north-facing windows. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps 24 years old, with the kind of face that conventional artists would have found challenging. Her features were not classically symmetrical. Her left eye sat slightly higher than her right. Her mouth curved more on one side than the other, and her nose showed the subtle deviation that comes from natural bone structure rather than injury. In short, her face displayed exactly the kind of asymmetries that my studies had taught me were essential for creating the impression of life. But it was her natural expression that captured my attention immediately. Lisa possessed what I had come to recognize as a transitional face. Even in repose, her features suggested movement, as if she were perpetually on the verge of speaking or smiling. The muscles around her mouth showed a subtle tension that pulled the left corner slightly upward. while her eyes held a quality of attention that suggested active thought rather than passive posing. During our first session, I made preliminary sketches while engaging her in conversation about her life, her interests, her thoughts on various subjects. This was not mere politeness, but careful observation. I needed to understand her habitual expressions, to identify which muscles she favored when animated, to see how her face moved naturally between different emotional states. I discovered that when genuinely amused, she smiled more with her eyes than with her mouth, creating the kind of expression I had observed in my anatomical studies, where multiple muscle groups work in subtle coordination. More importantly, I noticed that Lisa's face never settled into complete stillness. Even when she thought she was maintaining a neutral expression, micro movements continued around her eyes and mouth. The orbicularis oculi would tighten almost imperceptibly. The zygomaticus major would show the faintest hint of tension. The levator labiae superioris would shift position by fractions of an inch. These minute changes, invisible to casual observation, created the sense that her face was alive even in apparent repose. I began to realize that I had found the perfect subject for my experiment. Lisa's natural asymmetries and her tendency toward transitional expressions would allow me to paint a portrait that captured not just her appearance, but the very mechanism by which human faces suggest life and consciousness. I could embed my anatomical discoveries in a way that would create the most lifelike portrait ever painted, yet my methods would remain hidden beneath the surface of conventional portraiture. Francesco del Giocondo's commission letter had specified a traditional three-quarter pose against a simple background, the kind of formal portrait appropriate for a merchant's wife. But I convinced him to allow me greater creative freedom, explaining that I wanted to create something that would reflect particularly well on his taste and sophistication. He agreed, trusting my reputation and perhaps sensing that he was commissioning something extraordinary, though he could not have imagined what I was actually planning. My preparation became more intensive than for any previous painting. I created detailed anatomical sketches of Lisa's face, mapping the precise configuration of muscles beneath her skin. I studied how light fell across her features at different times of day, noting which angles enhanced the subtle asymmetries I wanted to capture and which positions of her head created the most compelling transitional expressions. I also began experimenting with new painting techniques that would allow me to render the soft gradations of muscle tension that traditional methods could not capture. The key was learning to paint not outlines but volumes, not surfaces but the structures beneath them. I developed ways of layering paint so thinly that colors seemed to emerge from within rather than lying on top of the panel, creating the kind of subtle modeling that could suggest the barely perceptible swells and depressions of muscle beneath skin. Lisa proved to be an ideal collaborator in this process, though she remained unaware of the scientific nature of what I was attempting. She was intelligent and curious, asking thoughtful questions about my methods and showing genuine interest in the technical aspects of painting. Her attention during our sessions was never passive. She remained mentally engaged, which meant that the subtle muscle tensions I wanted to capture remained present rather than fading into the blank stare of a bored model. During one particularly productive session, I asked her to think about a joke someone had told her recently while maintaining a composed expression appropriate for a formal portrait. The result was exactly what I had hoped to achieve. Her face showed the initial stages of amusement without breaking into actual laughter. The muscles around her eyes tightened slightly, the corners of her mouth began the upward movement that would become a smile, but the expression remained suspended in that transitional state that I had learned was most compelling to the human eye. I realized that I had discovered something beyond technique. By asking Lisa to hold thoughts and emotions just below the threshold of full expression, I could create a portrait that seemed to capture not just her appearance but her consciousness itself. The viewer would see a face that appeared to be thinking, to be on the verge of movement, to possess an inner life that traditional portraits could never suggest. The technical challenges were immense. How could I paint the barely perceptible asymmetry in her smile without making it appear accidental or unskilled? How could I render the subtle tension in her eyelids, that suggested attention without creating an expression that looked strained or artificial. How could I capture the way her left eye held a slightly different quality of light than her right, a difference so minute that it registered only subconsciously but contributed significantly to the sense of life in her face? My anatomical notebooks became essential tools, allowing me to understand exactly which muscles were creating the effects I observed and how to render them accurately with paint. Every session with Lisa became both portraiture and scientific experiment, as I tested my theories about what creates the appearance of life in a painted face. As the portrait progressed, I began to understand that I was creating something unprecedented. This was not simply a painting of Lisa Gherardini, but a demonstration of how scientific knowledge could revolutionize artistic expression. I was embedding everything I had learned about facial anatomy into a single image, creating a work that would preserve my discoveries even if my notebooks were lost or destroyed. The painting itself would become a repository of anatomical knowledge, hidden in plain sight where even the church could not recognize it as scientific investigation. The development of my painting technique became as important as my anatomical discoveries. Traditional methods, developed over generations of artists, were designed to create clear, readable images that told obvious stories or displayed evident beauty. What I needed was something subtler, a way to paint information that the eye could perceive without the mind fully recognizing what it was seeing. My custom mixed pigments became the foundation of this new approach. I began experimenting with combinations that previous artists had never attempted, seeking colors that could capture the subtle variations in skin tone that indicated particular states of muscle tension. The traditional flesh tones used in portraiture were too simple, too uniform to render the complex interplay of blood flow, shadow, and underlying structure that creates the appearance of life. I discovered that adding minute amounts of umber to the standard flesh mixture created a color that suggested the slight shadow cast by a muscle in subtle contraction. A touch of vermilion mixed with white could capture the barely perceptible warmth that appears around the eyes when the orbicularis oculi tightens in the beginning stages of a genuine smile. These were not colors that the conscious mind would notice, but they registered at a deeper level of perception, creating the sense that the painted face possessed qualities that purely visual analysis could not explain. The sfumato technique, which I developed specifically for this portrait, grew directly from my understanding of how light behaves when it encounters the complex surface of human skin. My anatomical studies had shown me that skin is not a uniform covering, but a complex landscape of microscopic hills and valleys created by the underlying muscle structure. Light falling on the surface creates gradations so subtle that hard lines cannot capture them adequately. Sfumato allowed me to build up these gradations through multiple transparent layers of paint, each one contributing to the overall effect without creating visible boundaries. By applying paint so thinly that it was almost like colored air, I could create transitions between light and shadow that mimic the way human skin actually reflects and absorbs light. This technique was particularly crucial on Lisa's mouth, where the subtle modeling of the muscles beneath required gradations that conventional painting methods could never achieve. But technique alone was not sufficient. I needed to understand the mathematical relationships that govern facial proportions and use this knowledge to create controlled optical illusions. My studies had revealed that human eyes are remarkably sensitive to asymmetry in faces, interpreting even minute deviations from perfect symmetry as indicators of life, thought, or emotion. I could use this sensitivity deliberately, creating asymmetries so subtle that viewers would not consciously notice them, yet would respond to them powerfully. The placement of Lisa's eyes required precise calculation. I positioned her left eye exactly 3 millimeters higher than her right, a difference small enough to escape conscious notice but significant enough to create the impression that her face was not frozen in perfect stillness. This asymmetry, combined with a slight difference in the curvature of her eyelids, suggested that she was in the process of some barely perceptible facial movement, creating the sense that she was about to blink, speak, or shift her expression. The famous smile demanded even more careful analysis. My anatomical notebooks contained detailed drawings of how the zygomaticus major, levator labii superioris, and surrounding muscles work together to create different types of smiles. I had identified 17 distinct configurations, each creating a different emotional impression. What I wanted for Lisa was something I had discovered in my studies of transitional expressions, the muscular configuration that exists in the moment just before a smile reaches completion. I achieved this by painting her left zygomaticus major in a state of slight tension while leaving the right side closer to neutral. The effect was an expression that appeared to be developing rather than fixed, as if the smile were emerging slowly and naturally rather than being posed for the painter. The viewer's eye, trained to read facial expressions as indicators of internal states, would interpret this transitional configuration as evidence that Lisa was experiencing some pleasant thought or emotion, creating an emotional connection between subject and observer that traditional portraiture could never achieve. The shadows around her mouth required the most delicate handling. I used my understanding of how light interacts with the specific topology created by particular muscle tensions to create shadows that enhanced rather than obscured the anatomical information I was embedding in the painting. Each shadow was precisely placed to suggest the presence of underlying muscle structure without making that structure obviously visible. My breakthrough in rendering the eyes came from studying how the orbicularis oculi creates the subtle crinkles that appear around the eyes during genuine expression. These microtensions, invisible in conventional portraiture, were crucial for creating the impression that Lisa's expression involved her entire face rather than just her mouth. By painting almost imperceptible variations in the skin around her eyes, I could suggest that the same neural signals creating her emerging smile were also affecting the muscles in the upper part of her face. The technical challenge of painting eyes that appear to follow the viewer required understanding how human visual perception processes faces. I discovered that the effect depends not on any magical quality of the painted eyes themselves, but on how the brain interprets the relationship between the direction of the gaze and the three-dimensional modeling of the face around it. By painting Lisa's eyes looking directly forward while modeling the surrounding features to suggest a face that is slightly angled, I created an optical illusion that makes her gaze seem to track with the viewer's movement. But perhaps my most significant innovation was learning to paint time itself. Traditional portraits capture a single moment, freezing the subject in an expression that quickly becomes obviously static. What I was attempting with Lisa's portrait was to paint not a moment but a process, to capture the face in a state of becoming rather than being. Every muscle I painted was rendered not in a fixed position but in a state of subtle transition, creating the impression that the expression was evolving even as one looked at it. This required developing an entirely new relationship with the painting process itself. Instead of working from preliminary drawings toward a predetermined final image, I allowed the portrait to evolve organically, making adjustments based on how each new layer affected the overall impression of life in Lisa's face. I would paint for hours, then step back to observe how the accumulation of subtle details was affecting the viewer's psychological response to the image. The layering process became almost meditative, each transparent glaze adding microscopic adjustments to the modeling of muscle beneath skin. I learned to paint individual muscle fibers not as distinct visible elements but as subtle variations in the direction of brushstrokes that would register subconsciously and contribute to the overall sense of organic structure beneath the surface. My understanding of how peripheral vision affects facial recognition allowed me to create another level of optical sophistication. The human eye sees faces differently when looking directly at them versus when they appear in peripheral vision, and I designed Lisa's portrait to take advantage of this difference. Details that were barely visible when looking directly at her face became more apparent when glimpsed indirectly, creating the impression that her expression was somehow more animated when not under direct scrutiny. Mathematical precision required for these effects was exhausting but exhilarating. Every placement of paint had to be calculated not just for its individual effect, but for how it would interact with every other element of the composition. The portrait became a complex equation in which anatomical accuracy, optical illusion, and psychological response had to balance perfectly to create the desired impression of life and consciousness. As the painting neared completion, I began to understand that I had achieved something beyond my initial ambitions. This was not simply a portrait that incorporated anatomical knowledge, but a work that translated scientific understanding into purely visual language. Every principle I had learned from my dissections, every discovery about the mechanics of expression, every insight into how human consciousness manifests itself in facial movement had been embedded in the painted surface, where it could communicate directly with the viewer's unconscious understanding of human behavior. I had created a painting that would function simultaneously as art and as science, as beauty and as knowledge, as decoration and as discovery. The portrait would preserve and communicate my anatomical insights in a form that could survive any suppression of scientific inquiry, hiding revolutionary knowledge in the guise of conventional beauty. The wax model of facial muscles that I created became my most valuable tool for understanding the precise mechanism behind Lisa's enigmatic expression. Working from my dissection notes, I carefully sculpted each muscle group in accurate proportion and position, creating a three-dimensional representation that allowed me to study how different combinations of muscle tensions would affect the overall appearance of a face. This model reveals something extraordinary about the specific configuration I had observed in Lisa's natural expression. When I manipulated the wax muscles to replicate the exact tensions I saw in her face, I discovered that her smile operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The primary movement involved the zygomaticus major on her left side, but this was supported by subtle adjustments in no fewer than 6 other muscle groups, each contributing to the overall effect in ways that traditional artistic observation had never recognized. The left side of Lisa's face showed characteristics that I had learned to associate with habitual expressiveness. Her zygomaticus major was slightly more developed, suggesting years of favoring that side when smiling. More significantly, the attachment points where this muscle connected to the surrounding facial structure showed the kind of adaptation that comes from frequent use. This natural asymmetry meant that even in apparent repose, her left side retained a memory of motion that created the foundation for her distinctive expression. But the true secret lay in what I had discovered about the levator labii superioris, the muscle responsible for raising the upper lip. In most faces, this muscle works in simple coordination with the zygomaticus major, creating predictable, readable expressions. Lisa's face was different. Her levator labia superioris showed a pattern of tension that I had previously observed only in the transitional states between expressions, as if her natural resting state existed in the space between neutral and smiling. Using my wax model, I could demonstrate exactly why this configuration created such a compelling visual effect. When viewed from different angles, the interplay between the slightly elevated left corner of her mouth and the corresponding tension in her upper lip created different impressions. From straight on, the expression appeared neutral with hints of amusement. From slightly to the left, it suggested the beginning of a smile. From the right, it seemed almost melancholy, as if she were suppressing some emotion. This discovery led me to understand that what people called the mystery of Lisa's smile was actually the result of painting a face that existed in multiple emotional states simultaneously. I had captured not a single expression, but a configuration of muscles that the human brain would interpret differently depending on the viewing angle, the quality of light, and even the emotional state of the observer. The role of the orbicularis oculi in creating this effect proved even more crucial than I had initially realized. This muscle, which encircles each eye, responds sympathetically to movements in the lower face during genuine expressions. In Lisa's case, the subtle asymmetry in her mouth created a corresponding asymmetry in the muscle tension around her eyes, but at such a minimal level that it registered only subconsciously. My anatomical studies had shown me that genuine smiles involve the entire face, while forced or artificial smiles engage only the muscles around the mouth. By painting Lisa with the barely perceptible eye tension that accompanies real amusement, I had embedded visual proof that her expression was authentic rather than posed, creating a psychological connection between viewer and subject that transcended the normal limitations of portraiture. The technical challenge of rendering these micro-expressions required developing an understanding of how light interacts with muscle tension at the most subtle levels. I discovered that when the orbicularis oculi contracts even minimally, it creates microscopic changes in the surface topology of the surrounding skin. These changes are invisible to direct observation but affect how light is reflected and absorbed, creating shadow patterns that the human eye processes as information about emotional state. In Lisa's portrait, I used this knowledge to create shadows around her eyes that suggested the presence of muscle tension without making that tension obviously visible. The effect was that viewers would unconsciously read her expression as genuine and animated without being able to identify exactly what visual cues were creating that impression. My breakthrough in understanding facial asymmetry came from studying how different viewing positions affect the perception of expression. The human brain processes faces using specialized neural pathways that are extraordinarily sensitive to asymmetry, interpreting even minute deviations from perfect symmetry as indicators of life, emotion, or consciousness. I realized that I could use this sensitivity deliberately, creating carefully calculated asymmetries that would enhance the impression of life in Lisa's painted face. The mathematical precision required was extraordinary. I measured the exact position of every feature, calculating the optimal degree of asymmetry that would suggest life without appearing obviously unbalanced. Lisa's left eye needed to be positioned exactly 3 millimeters higher than her right to create the impression of natural facial movement. Her left eyebrow required a curve that was 2 degrees steeper than her right to suggest the kind of micro-expression that accompanies internal thought. But the most sophisticated aspect of the smile's mechanism involved what I had learned about the psychological effect of viewing faces frozen in transitional states. When the human brain encounters a face that appears to be in the process of changing expression, it automatically attempts to predict what the completed expression will be. This creates a sense of anticipation, a feeling that the person in the portrait is about to speak, laugh, or reveal some hidden thought. I achieved this effect by painting Lisa's face in the precise muscular configuration that exists in the moment just before a smile reaches completion. The zygomaticus major shows the initial tension that will lift the corner of the mouth, but the movement is not yet complete. The levator labii superioris has begun to engage but has not yet reached its full contraction. The result is an expression that appears to be developing in real time, creating the illusion of movement in a static image. The shadows I painted around Lisa's mouth were calculated to enhance this transitional quality. By studying how light falls across faces during actual expression changes, I learned to paint shadows that suggested muscular movement even when the muscles themselves appeared relatively still. These shadows were so subtle that they operated below the threshold of conscious perception, yet they contributed significantly to the overall impression that Lisa's expression was dynamic rather than frozen. My understanding of how peripheral vision affects facial recognition allowed me to create another layer of sophistication in the portrait's psychological impact. The human visual system processes faces differently when they appear in central versus peripheral vision, and I designed Lisa's expression to take advantage of this difference. Details that were barely visible when looking directly at her face became more apparent when glimpsed indirectly, creating the impression that her expression was somehow more animated when viewed obliquely. The phenomenon that observers reported of Lisa's smile seeming to appear and disappear depending on where they looked was actually the result of this carefully orchestrated interplay between direct and peripheral vision. When viewers focused on her eyes, their peripheral vision would register the subtle muscle tensions around her mouth as suggesting a smile. When they shifted their attention to her mouth, their peripheral vision would process the micro-expressions around her eyes as indicators of amusement or contemplation. Through my wax model experiments, I discovered that this effect was strongest when the overall asymmetry of the face followed specific proportional relationships that I could express mathematically. The position of each feature relative to every other had to conform to precise ratios that would optimize the brain's tendency to read life and consciousness into facial configurations. Too much asymmetry would appear obviously unnatural, while too little would fail to create the desired sense of animation. The final element of the smile's secret mechanism involved understanding how the viewer's own emotional state would affect their interpretation of Lisa's expression. I had learned from my anatomical studies that human beings unconsciously mirror the facial expressions they observe, creating a feedback loop between the viewed face and the viewer's own emotional response. By painting an expression that encouraged this mirroring response while remaining ambiguous enough to avoid triggering a specific emotional interpretation, I created a portrait that would seem to respond to the viewer's own inner state. The result was an image that functioned as a kind of emotional mirror, appearing to reflect the viewer's own consciousness back at them, while maintaining the distinct personality and presence of the painted subject. This was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of what I had achieved, creating a painted face that seemed to possess an inner life while simultaneously connecting with the inner life of the observer. The preserved human eye that I kept in a sealed jar became my guide to understanding the most complex aspect of facial animation. Unlike other organs, the eye remains remarkably intact after death, allowing me to study its structure with unprecedented detail. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about how consciousness appears in painted faces. My dissections revealed that the human eye is not simply an organ of vision, but a complex mechanism whose every movement is controlled by 6 distinct muscles working in precise coordination. The superior, inferior, medial, and lateral recti control the primary directions of gaze, while the superior and inferior obliques manage the subtle rotations that allow for complex tracking movements. Understanding this muscular architecture was crucial for creating eyes that appeared alive rather than merely accurate. But the real breakthrough came from studying how these eye muscles connect to the broader network of facial expression. I discovered that the muscles controlling eye movement share neural pathways with those governing facial expression, creating involuntary coordination between gaze direction and emotional display. When someone experiences genuine amusement, their eye muscles automatically adjust in subtle ways that complement the smile forming on their lips. This coordination happens below the level of conscious control, which explained why artificial expressions always appeared somehow hollow or unconvincing. In Lisa's case, I observed that her natural gaze possessed a quality I had learned to recognize from my anatomical studies, the slight tension in the extraocular muscles that accompanies active attention. Her eyes were never simply pointed in a direction, but were actively engaged with whatever held her focus. This engagement created micro-adjustments in muscle tension that were invisible individually but combined to create the impression that intelligence and consciousness operated behind her gaze. The technical challenge of painting this quality required developing entirely new approaches to rendering the eye itself. Traditional portraiture treated eyes as static objects, carefully drawn spheres with predetermined highlights and shadows. What I needed was a way to paint the subtle evidence of muscular activity, the barely perceptible adjustments that indicate an eye that is actively seeing rather than merely looking. My solution involved understanding how light interacts with the complex surface of the eye under different states of muscular tension. When the extraocular muscles engage, they create microscopic changes in the shape of the eye itself, affecting how light reflects from the corneal surface and how shadows fall around the orbital cavity. These changes are far too subtle for conscious observation, but they register powerfully in the unconscious processes by which we read life and attention in other faces. I developed the technique for painting these micro-tensions by building up multiple transparent layers around Lisa's eyes, each one contributing to the overall sense of muscular engagement without creating any obviously visible detail. The effect was that her painted eyes possessed the same quality of active attention that I had observed in her living face, creating the impression that she was not simply posing for a portrait, but actively observing and responding to the world around her. The phenomenon of eyes that appear to follow the viewer required an even deeper understanding of human visual perception. I discovered that this effect depends not on any magical quality of the painted eyes themselves, but on how the brain processes the relationship between gaze direction and facial orientation. By painting Lisa looking directly forward while subtly modeling her face to suggest a head position that is slightly angled, I created an optical illusion that makes her gaze seem to track with viewer movement. But this was only the foundation for a more sophisticated effect. My anatomical studies had shown me that genuine eye contact involves more than simply looking in the right direction. The muscles around the eyes must show the tension that accompanies focused attention. The tear ducts must be positioned to suggest the micro-adjustments of active vision, and the eyelids must display the subtle asymmetries that indicate a living eye rather than a glass one. Lisa's left eye, I noticed, held a slightly different quality of attention than her right. This asymmetry was so subtle that it escaped conscious notice, but it contributed significantly to the sense that her gaze was dynamic rather than fixed. Her left eyelid sat fractionally higher, suggesting the kind of micro-expression that accompanies internal thought or amusement. Her right eye showed a softer focus, as if part of her attention was directed inward rather than entirely engaged with external observation. Painting this asymmetry required mathematical precision. The difference in eyelid position needed to be exactly large enough to create the impression of natural variation without appearing obviously unbalanced. I calculated that a difference of 1.5 millimeters was optimal, significant enough to register unconsciously, but small enough to avoid conscious detection. The shadows around Lisa's eyes became crucial for suggesting the presence of muscular activity beneath the surface. I had learned from my dissections that the orbicularis oculi, the muscle that encircles each eye, creates distinct shadow patterns when engaged at different levels of tension. By painting these shadows with anatomical accuracy, I could suggest that Lisa's eyes were animated by the same neural activity that controlled her emerging smile. My breakthrough in understanding peripheral vision allowed me to create another layer of psychological sophistication. The human visual system processes faces using two distinct pathways, one for central vision that focuses on specific details, and another for peripheral vision that assesses overall facial configuration and emotional state. I designed Lisa's eyes to take advantage of this difference, creating details that were more apparent when viewed indirectly than when examined directly. This effect contributed to observers' reports that Lisa's expression seemed to change depending on where they looked. When focusing on her mouth, their peripheral vision would process the subtle tensions around her eyes as indicators of amusement or contemplation. When looking directly at her eyes, their peripheral vision would register the emerging smile as evidence of emotional engagement with the viewer. The relationship between tear duct placement and perceived emotion proved more important than I had initially realized. My anatomical studies showed that the lacrimal caruncle, the small pink structure in the inner corner of each eye, shifts position slightly during different emotional states due to changes in the surrounding muscle tensions. By painting Lisa's tear ducts in the positions they would occupy during a state of subtle amusement, I embedded another layer of emotional information that would register unconsciously. But perhaps my most significant discovery involved the role of the upper eyelid in conveying consciousness and intelligence. The levator palpebrae superioris, the muscle that raises the upper eyelid, shows constant micro-adjustments during active thinking and attention. These movements are far too subtle for direct observation, but their absence is one of the primary reasons why unconscious or dead faces appear lifeless even when otherwise undamaged. I learned to paint the subtle evidence of this muscular activity by creating almost imperceptible variations in the curve of Lisa's upper eyelids. These variations suggested the presence of the continuous micro-adjustments that accompany consciousness, creating the impression that her mind was actively engaged even in the apparent stillness of post-portraiture. The coordination between Lisa's eye movements and her emerging smile required understanding how genuine expressions involve the entire face working as an integrated system. My anatomical studies had revealed that authentic smiles trigger sympathetic responses in the muscles around the eyes, creating the coordination that distinguishes real amusement from artificial poses. By painting this coordination accurately, I embedded visual proof that Lisa's expression was genuine rather than constructed for the painter's convenience. The final element involved understanding how the viewer's own eye movements would affect their perception of Lisa's gaze. I had observed that people automatically track faces when viewing portraits, unconsciously seeking the kind of dynamic interaction they experience with living faces. By designing Lisa's eyes to reward this tracking behavior with subtle variations in apparent expression, I created a portrait that seemed to respond to the viewer's attention in the same way that a living person would. The result was a painted face whose eyes possessed not just accuracy but the complex indicators of consciousness, attention, and emotional engagement that we unconsciously seek when looking at other human beings. Lisa's painted gaze carried the same quality of active intelligence that had characterized her living presence, creating a portrait that seemed to bridge the gap between image and reality through pure understanding of how consciousness manifests itself in human features. The final varnish mixture that I prepared for Lisa's portrait was unlike any I had used before. Traditional varnishes serve simply to protect the painted surface from dust and moisture, but I needed something that would preserve the subtle optical effects I had embedded in the layers beneath. After months of experimentation, I developed a formula using purified tree resins and oils that would remain transparent for centuries while enhancing rather than obscuring the delicate interplay of light and shadow that created Lisa's lifelike appearance. As I applied this protective coating with careful, even strokes, I realized I was sealing away more than paint. Every principle I had learned from my forbidden anatomical studies, every discovery about the mechanics of human expression, every insight into how consciousness manifests itself in facial movement lay preserved beneath this transparent shield. The portrait had become a repository of knowledge that could survive any suppression of scientific inquiry. Lisa's final session took place on a morning in late autumn, when the light through my studio windows had acquired the golden quality that comes with the changing season. As she took her familiar position, I made the last adjustments to her expression, ensuring that the subtle muscle tensions I had painted would continue to suggest life and thought even when viewed under different lighting conditions. The technical challenges had been solved, but I found myself reluctant to declare the work complete. When I finally showed Lisa the finished portrait, her reaction surprised me. She studied her painted face with the same careful attention I had observed during our sessions, but her expression showed something I had not expected, a kind of recognition that went beyond simple approval or vanity. She seemed to understand, perhaps unconsciously, that what she was seeing transcended conventional portraiture. "It looks more like me than I do," she said finally, a comment that revealed more insight than she could have realized. What she was recognizing was the accuracy with which I had captured not just her appearance, but the underlying mechanisms that created her appearance. The painted face possessed the same asymmetries, the same subtle muscle tensions, the same evidence of consciousness that characterized her living features, but rendered with a precision that nature itself could not maintain consistently. Francesco del Giocondo arrived that afternoon to examine the completed commission. His reaction was more complex than Lisa's had been. As a successful merchant, he understood quality and craftsmanship, and he could see immediately that what I had created exceeded anything he had expected. But I also sensed his puzzlement at certain aspects of the portrait that departed from conventional expectations. "The expression seems to change as I look at it," he observed, moving from side to side to test his perception. "And the eyes, they appear to be watching me." These were exactly the effects I had worked to achieve, but explaining them would have required revealing the anatomical knowledge that informed my technique. Instead, I simply assured him that these qualities would make the portrait more valuable and memorable than traditional commissions. It was during this conversation that I made a decision that would alter the course of art history. Francesco had commissioned the portrait to demonstrate his prosperity and refined taste, but what I had created was something far more significant, a scientific achievement disguised as artistic beauty. The knowledge embedded in this painting was too important to hang in a merchant's home where it might be damaged, lost, or simply unappreciated for what it truly represented. I explained to Francesco that the portrait required additional work, technical adjustments that would take several more months to complete. This was not entirely false. I did want to make further refinements based on what I had learned during the painting process, but my real purpose was to delay delivery while I considered the larger implications of what I had achieved. The decision to keep the painting rather than deliver it came gradually, born from my growing understanding of what I had accomplished. This was not simply a portrait of Lisa Gherardini, but a demonstration that art could serve as a vehicle for preserving and transmitting scientific knowledge. The anatomical discoveries that the Church might condemn as heretical investigation were here transformed into beauty that even the most conservative observer would admire. In my private notebooks, I began to document the techniques I had developed, creating a record of how anatomical knowledge could be embedded in painted surfaces. These notes were written in my mirror script, making them difficult for casual observers to read, but I knew that determined scholars would eventually decode them. The combination of the portrait itself and these technical explanations would preserve my discoveries for future generations who might be more receptive to the integration of art and science. The months following the portrait's completion brought unexpected consequences. Word of the painting spread through Florence's artistic community, and other painters began requesting opportunities to examine my technique. I allowed carefully controlled viewings, watching how different observers responded to the effects I had created. Their reactions confirmed what I had hoped. The anatomical accuracy I had embedded in the painting registered powerfully at unconscious levels, creating emotional responses that transcended normal appreciation of artistic skill. Younger artists attempted to copy my methods, but their efforts revealed how much specialized knowledge was required for success. They could imitate the external appearance of my sfumato technique, but without understanding the anatomical principles that guided its application, their portraits lacked the sense of life that characterized Lisa's painted features. This confirmed my belief that true innovation in art required scientific understanding, not merely technical skill. The portrait's growing reputation created its own problems. Francesco del Giocondo became increasingly insistent about taking possession of the work he had commissioned, while other wealthy patrons offered substantial sums for similar portraits. I found myself in the awkward position of having to explain why I could not simply repeat what I had accomplished, why each such portrait would require years of preparation and study. The truth was that Lisa's portrait represented the culmination of decades of anatomical investigation. The specific knowledge embedded in its painted surface could not be quickly transferred to other subjects or replicated on demand. Each face would require its own detailed study, its own analysis of muscular structure and habitual expression, its own carefully calculated asymmetries and optical illusions. I had created a masterpiece, but not a reproducible technique. As seasons passed and the portrait remained in my studio, I began to understand that I was the guardian of something larger than a single painting. The knowledge preserved in Lisa's painted features represented a new way of understanding the relationship between scientific investigation and artistic expression. This was not simply anatomy applied to art, but a demonstration that the boundaries between different forms of human understanding were more fluid than traditional thinking acknowledged. My notebooks from this period reveal my growing awareness that the portrait had become a kind of time capsule, preserving Renaissance anatomical knowledge in a form that could survive political and religious upheavals that might destroy written records. The church could burn books and manuscripts, but they could hardly condemn a portrait that appeared to be nothing more than exceptionally skillful representation of feminine beauty. The irony was profound. My most scientifically accurate work would be celebrated for its artistic mystery. My most systematic investigation would be praised for its emotional appeal. My most rational achievement would be treasured for its apparently inexplicable qualities. The anatomical knowledge that I had risked everything to acquire would be preserved precisely because its presence in the painting remained invisible to those who had not shared my forbidden studies. As I applied the final protective varnish and sealed Lisa's portrait for posterity, I understood that I had achieved something unprecedented. The creation of art that functioned simultaneously as science, beauty that preserved knowledge, mystery that was actually mathematical precision disguised. The painting would outlive me, outlive the religious prohibitions that had made my studies dangerous, outlive the political structures that had limited scientific inquiry. In preserving Lisa Gherardini's likeness, I had also preserved the possibility that future generations might recognize what I had embedded in her painted features and understand that the separation between art and science was not as absolute as their contemporaries believed. The portrait would continue to smile with the mechanical precision I had discovered in human expression, continue to gaze with the evidence of consciousness I had learned to paint, continued to embody the anatomical truths I had risked everything to understand. My final self-portrait, painted with hands that trembled from age, but eyes that had seen more than any artist before me, became a mirror reflecting on a life spent balancing discovery with discretion. In that late work, I painted my own face with the same anatomical understanding I had brought to Lisa's portrait, capturing not just my appearance, but the accumulated weight of knowledge that had shaped my features through decades of forbidden inquiry. The irony of my situation had become clear over the years. My most scientifically accurate work would be celebrated for its mystery rather than its precision. Future generations would see enigma where I had painted knowledge, magic where I had applied mechanics. The very success of my anatomical understanding would ensure that its scientific foundation remained hidden, protected by the viewer's inability to recognize what they were actually seeing. This concealment was perhaps my greatest achievement. I had found a way to preserve revolutionary knowledge in a form that could survive any suppression of scientific inquiry. The church could burn anatomical texts, forbid dissection, and punish empirical investigation, but they could never destroy what they could not recognize as science. Lisa's portrait would endure as a religious icon or aesthetic treasure, carrying within its painted surface a complete record of discoveries that had cost me years of dangerous nocturnal work. The satisfaction of having preserved anatomical truth in plain sight grew deeper as I aged. Every time I looked at the portrait, I saw not just Lisa's face, but the demonstration of everything I had learned about the relationship between consciousness and physical structure. The painting proved that what we call the soul, the spark of life that animates human features, was nothing more mysterious than the precise coordination of muscles, the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the carefully orchestrated asymmetries that distinguish living faces from death masks. This understanding had profound implications that extended far beyond portraiture. If consciousness could be painted by accurately rendering its physical manifestations, if the appearance of inner life was simply the visible result of anatomical processes working in harmony, then perhaps consciousness itself was less mysterious than philosophers claimed. Perhaps the difference between mind and matter, between spiritual and physical, was not an unbridgeable gap, but simply a matter of sufficient complexity and coordination. My hope that future anatomists would recognize the knowledge embedded in Lisa's portrait sustained me through the isolation that often accompanied my unconventional methods. I had created a form of communication that could transmit complex scientific information directly to those prepared to receive it, while remaining invisible to those who lacked the necessary understanding. The portrait was simultaneously a work of art for general appreciation and a scientific document for specialist study. But I also understood that the painting's most important function might be its demonstration that the boundaries between art and science were artificial. What I had achieved with Lisa's portrait proved that the most profound artistic effects could emerge from the most rigorous scientific investigation, that beauty and truth were not competing values, but different aspects of the same fundamental harmony. The painting showed that empirical observation could enhance rather than diminish aesthetic achievement. The Church's prohibition against anatomical study, which had forced me to work in secret, had inadvertently led to this more perfect synthesis. By preventing the open publication of anatomical knowledge, religious authorities had compelled me to find alternative means of preserving and communicating my discoveries. The result was a form of scientific documentation that was simultaneously more beautiful and more enduring than any written treatise could have been. As my own abilities declined with age, I took increasing comfort in knowing that my most important insights would outlive me. Lisa's portrait contained not just individual discoveries, but a complete methodology, a demonstration of how empirical observation could be translated into visual language. Future artists who possess sufficient anatomical understanding would be able to decode not just what I had learned, but how I had learned it. The painting would serve as proof that innovation often requires hiding in plain sight. The most revolutionary ideas I had learned survived not through bold proclamation, but through careful disguise. By embedding anatomical knowledge within conventional artistic forms, I had created something that could communicate revolutionary insights while appearing perfectly orthodox to unsympathetic observers. This strategy of concealment had broader applications beyond my own work. Any scientific investigation that challenged established doctrine could potentially be preserved through similar means. Knowledge could be embedded in music, architecture, poetry, or any form of cultural expression that would be valued and preserved, even by those who might oppose the ideas it contained. My refusal to separate art from scientific inquiry had led to discoveries that neither pure art nor pure science could have achieved alone. The anatomical accuracy that made Lisa's portrait so lifelike was inseparable from the aesthetic effects that made it so compelling. Technical understanding and creative expression had merged into something greater than either could accomplish independently. The lasting impact of this fusion would extend far beyond my own career. I had demonstrated that the most profound artistic achievements required not just sensitivity and skill, but deep understanding of the subjects being depicted. Future artists who studied anatomy, optics, engineering, and natural philosophy would be capable of creating works that transcended the limitations of purely conventional approaches. But perhaps most importantly, I had shown that knowledge itself could be a form of art, that the pursuit of understanding was not separate from the creation of beauty, but was its highest expression. The hundreds of hours I had spent in cold underground chambers, the years of careful observation and meticulous documentation, the patient development of new painting techniques had all culminated in something that was simultaneously scientific achievement and aesthetic triumph. Lisa's portrait would endure as a demonstration of what human investigation could accomplish when freed from artificial boundaries between different forms of inquiry. The painting was neither purely artistic nor purely scientific, but something new, a perfect integration of empirical observation and creative expression that pointed toward possibilities that my era was not yet ready to embrace. As I contemplated the portrait in my final years, I understood that I had created more than a revolutionary work of art. I had created a new form of human communication, one that could transmit complex understanding directly through visual experience. The painting spoke not just to the conscious mind, but to the deeper processes by which human beings recognize life, intelligence, and consciousness in other faces. The anatomical knowledge that I had risked my reputation and safety to acquire had been transformed into something that could touch the hearts and minds of people who would never study medicine or natural philosophy. Through Lisa's painted features, the insights gained from dissection and empirical observation could reach anyone capable of responding to a human face, creating a bridge between specialized knowledge and universal human experience. This was perhaps the ultimate vindication of my approach to learning and creation. By refusing to accept the artificial separation between art and science, between beauty and truth, between aesthetic appreciation and empirical investigation, I had discovered new possibilities for human expression and communication. The portrait of Lisa Gherardini would stand as permanent testimony to what could be achieved when curiosity, knowledge, and creative skill worked together in perfect harmony. The legacy I was leaving was not just a collection of discoveries or innovations, but a demonstration of how human beings could transcend the limitations imposed by conventional thinking. The painting would inspire future generations not just to see differently, but to think differently about the relationship between understanding and expression, between knowledge and beauty, between the investigation of truth and the creation of lasting human value.